Beneath the cobbled streets of a quiet European town, hidden under centuries of stone and silence, there exists a place so depraved, so meticulously engineered for agony, that it seems more like the fever dream of a sadist than something built by human hands. This wasn't just a prison. It wasn't even just a torture chamber. It was a factory of pain, a dungeon designed with one purpose: to extract screams and to never stop. From walls that echoed to amplify the shrieks, to iron devices crafted to prolong death for weeks, every inch of this underground lair was a symphony of suffering. Its creator? A nobleman praised in public and feared in whispers. A man who shook hands with kings while crushing lives in darkness. Hundreds entered. None left whole. Most never left at all. And when his secret was finally discovered, it wasn't the horror that shocked the world. It was who helped him build it, who knew and did nothing. This is the story of the dungeon that was never meant to silence its victims, but to keep them screaming forever. In the heart of Moravia, modern-day Czech Republic, nestled among cold hills and fog-drenched forests, sat a town with no name left on modern maps. A village erased by time, and perhaps by intention. For centuries, it was known only for the castle that loomed over it, a towering mass of stone and shadow that locals came to fear more than they feared war, wolves, or even plague. At first, the signs were subtle. A young boy disappeared while fetching water. A stable hand was gone by morning. A newlywed couple failed to return from delivering grain to the castle gates. Each event, a whisper, a quiet murmur at the marketplace, a priest's trembling voice mid-sermon, a mother staring too long at the forest, eyes hollow. The town's lord, Count Matej Hruza, was a man of presence. Charismatic, well-spoken, and dressed in the richest fabrics, he hosted balls for traveling nobility and gave coin generously to the local church. But his gaze, it carried weight. People swore he never blinked long enough, that he watched, even when smiling. Especially then. Strangely, complaints never made it to the capital. Or if they did, they vanished along the way, along with the messengers. And so, the villagers turned inward. Children weren't allowed out after dark. Families tied red cloth to their door handles for protection. When dogs barked at nothing, people stayed indoors. Then came the sound. Some nights, only some, you could hear it just before dawn. A faint, chilling cry rising from under the earth. Not loud, not desperate, just persistent, like someone calling out from behind a stone wall, deep below your feet. A voice that never faded. A scream without breath. The church bells rang earlier. Midnight curfews became law. And though Count Hruza's castle seemed as pristine and golden as ever, it had begun to rot at the edges. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Whatever was happening under there. There were rumors that the Count had once traveled to Italy, that he'd studied under the architects of Florence, not for beauty or bridges, but to learn how buildings could contain sound, how chambers could echo, how stone could turn a whisper into a thunderclap. When he returned, he hired masons from across Europe, promised them fortune to build a cellar beneath his wine cellar. Most never finished the job. A few were never seen again. But it wasn't until a shepherd boy found something buried in the woods that fear turned into horror. It was a jawbone, small, human, cracked in half. Beside it, a rusted shackle. The townsfolk marched, torches in hand, toward the castle. But the gates were closed, and guards armed with crossbows turned them away with a single warning: return to your homes, or share the fate of the lost. What followed was silence. A silence so heavy, it rang louder than the scream. But beneath that silence, something stirred. In the dark, behind thick walls and locked iron doors, a plan was being set in motion. One not to punish wrongdoers, but to keep them screaming. Forever. Count Matej Hruza was born into privilege, but not expectation. The third son of a disinterested noble, he was never meant to inherit land or power. His brothers were bred for war and governance. Matej was left to his own devices, drifting between tutors and ancient libraries, hiding in catacombs, fascinated by death, and more disturbingly, what lingered just before it. He was obsessed with limits, how much the human body could endure, how far the mind could bend before it broke. His journals, uncovered centuries later in fragments, read less like philosophy and more like experimentation. Pain is the purest language. Fear is a doorway, not a wall. The scream is the soul leaving in pieces. As a teenager, he disappeared for nearly 2 years. Some claimed he traveled through the Italian states, seeking out inquisitors, torturers, even grave robbers. Others said he went farther east, learning forbidden techniques from Persian executioners. When he returned, he was different, colder, precise. He watched people the way a butcher studies meat. His inheritance came unexpectedly. Both older brothers, robust, seasoned warriors, fell ill after a hunting trip. Within days, they were dead. The official cause was pneumonia of the lungs. The village priest whispered a different phrase, mercy poisoning. No investigation followed. At 23, Matej Hruza became count of the region. Within weeks, he dismissed most of the staff. The castle doors were bolted. Carpenters and blacksmiths were brought in, working long nights on the lower levels. It was said he offered triple wages, but few returned after the job was done. Those who did spoke little, only of strange blueprints, of tunnels dug into bedrock, of ceiling hooks and drain channels leading nowhere, and of the sounds: hammering, screaming, laughter. In public, Count Hruza played his part. He smiled at festivals, donated to the church, hosted banquets filled with wine and music and charming anecdotes. But behind closed doors, the facade cracked. Visitors noted the way he flinched at laughter, how he froze during music, as if remembering something else entirely. One ambassador wrote, "He is a man who lives in constant anticipation, as though something, beneath him, is always happening." Behind the estate, a second cellar was constructed. The official purpose was wine storage. But no wine was ever stored there. Instead, carts entered by night, covered in tarps. Sometimes, the tarps twitched. The local guard, men loyal to the count by gold, not honor, began conscripting villagers under obscure accusations: trespassing, disloyalty, vagabondry. Many were never seen again. Some reappeared, changed, limping, eyes sunken. One woman was found weeks later, arms twisted from their sockets, hair completely white. She never spoke again. Yet no uprising came. The count's wealth ensured silence, and fear ensured obedience. One winter, a traveling monk arrived. He begged entry into the castle, claiming divine visions had drawn him there. The count allowed him in. He was never seen again. In spring, a new church bell was donated, cast, reportedly, from melted iron bars salvaged from old holdings. But beneath the surface of noble dinners and polite politics, a predator was perfecting his hunt. Count Hruza wasn't just torturing victims. He was studying them, cataloging pain, refining agony. And when the dungeon was finally complete, it wasn't just a room. It was a labyrinth. A place where screams didn't echo, they harmonized. A place where pain wasn't a mistake, it was the purpose. A place where no god could hear you, only the count. What Count Matej Hruza built beneath his castle wasn't a dungeon in the traditional sense. It was something far more insidious. It was a machine, a living, breathing organism of stone, iron, and blood. A place designed with a singular purpose, not to house prisoners, but to orchestrate pain. Archaeologists, centuries later, would stand dumbfounded at its complexity. The angles of the walls, the precision of the vents. The structure itself seemed to channel sound, feeding it through narrow corridors and amplifying it, until even a whisper would carry like a scream. But it wasn't accidental. It was design. The blueprints, recovered partially from the count's private study, showed measurements marked not in meters, but in decibels. He consulted not builders, but acousticians. A forgotten sect of them, some say, known for building opera houses and cathedral chambers. Hruza repurposed their talents, not to carry music to adoring crowds, but to make sure that no scream died unheard. The entrance to the chamber was hidden behind a rotating shelf in the castle's library. Beyond it, a spiral staircase carved directly into stone. No torch mounts, no handrails, just a descent into blackness. At the bottom, the true horror began. Each room had a name. Not numbers, names. The choir hall, the echo loop, the iron lullaby. The walls were embedded with copper mesh to conduct warmth or cold, depending on the torment needed. Drainage grooves were cut into the floor, funneling bodily fluids into sealed pits. The temperature was controlled by a series of furnaces placed in adjacent corridors, capable of turning the air from freezing to blistering in minutes. But the most terrifying detail? The acoustic mirrors. Polished stone concaves embedded at perfect intervals. These weren't for observation, they were for sound manipulation. A scream from one end would be captured, bounced, and reverberated for nearly 30 seconds. Each cry layered over the next, until the chamber itself howled. Imagine being shackled, tortured, and then hearing your own scream return to you. Louder, longer, reshaped into something inhuman. The Count's journal notes reveal his obsession with cathartic resonance. He believed that prolonged exposure to one's own amplified suffering would break down mental barriers, pushing a victim beyond pain and into spiritual collapse. He wasn't merely inflicting torment. He was experimenting with transcendence through agony. In one disturbing entry, he wrote, "When the subject begins to scream to drown out their own echo, the threshold is crossed. From there, they become something less. Or perhaps, something more." Each chamber had a purpose. One room forced victims to stand on glass marbles while being whipped, the uneven footing intensifying the pain with every movement. Another chamber slowly rotated, using a series of ropes and pulleys, so victims could never anticipate where the next blow would come from. One was completely silent, a deprivation cell sealed so tightly that you could hear your own heartbeat thunder like a drum. Some begged to return to the louder rooms. And then, there was the choir hall. This room, perhaps the Count's most twisted creation, was designed to hold multiple victims at once. Their screams would converge, echo, and feed into each other. At the center of the room was a horn-shaped structure, a listening station. Prusa would stand there, cloaked in velvet, hands clasped, as though attending a symphony. To him, this wasn't torture. It was performance. He would take notes, adjust instruments, change techniques. Some rooms were designed to sustain a victim for hours, others for weeks. A system of traps ensured that even escape attempts became part of the spectacle. Trip wires released blinding powder or scalding water. Floors collapsed into spike pits. There was no way out. And above it all, the castle sat in stillness, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, the suffering beneath. But it was never truly silent. Because beneath every noble's toast, beneath every violin played in the great hall, there was always the faintest sound, a low, steady chorus of screams that never ended. To understand the true horror of Count Hruza's dungeon, one must confront the devices themselves, tools not of death, but of durational agony. He didn't want his victims to die quickly. He wanted them to last, to suffer until their minds detached from their bodies, until even time forgot them. These weren't standard torture instruments borrowed from the Inquisition. Hruza was an innovator, some might say an artisan of pain. He commissioned blacksmiths from as far as Bavaria, each sworn to secrecy, each given diagrams with instructions so precise they read like surgical blueprints. The first known device was the cradle of grief. At a glance, it looked like a simple iron chair, but the armrests were lined with reversed barbs. Victims were strapped in and forced to rest their weight. Any movement meant flesh tearing. Sitting still? Numbness, eventual nerve damage, and the constant sting of slow, bleeding cuts. But Hruza didn't stop at pain. He wanted confusion, despair, a descent into madness. Enter the mirror box. It was a coffin-like structure lined entirely with reflective glass, on the floor, ceiling, and walls. Victims were locked inside naked, in total silence, for days. No sound, no warmth, just the endless image of their own suffering from every direction. If the mirrors didn't drive them mad, the isolation did. One survivor, yes, one, recounted that she began to see other faces in the reflections, faces that weren't hers. Whispering. Another horror, the breath harp, a grotesque wind instrument attached to a steel mask. The device forced air through a series of metal reeds whenever the victim exhaled, producing distorted, wheezing music. But the airways were razor thin, so every breath was a battle, every inhale a gasp, every exhale a song of suffering. The Count reportedly sat for hours, eyes closed, listening to the music of lungs in torment. Even more grotesque was the bloom, a twisted parody of the Iron Maiden. Instead of nails, it was lined with spines that opened inward like petals. Once sealed, the device would breathe, expanding and contracting slightly with a gear system. This motion didn't kill. It rubbed, slowly, over days, until flesh became pulp, until nerves screamed louder than the mouth ever could. These were not accidents of engineering. They were masterpieces of malevolence. And each one had a name, a ritual, a purpose. Prusa even recorded the duration victims lasted inside each device. He experimented with variations. Humidity, hunger, isolation. The dungeon, in a sense, became his laboratory. And his victims? Not just subjects, but instruments in a twisted orchestra. Each scream was a data point. Each scar, a note in his symphony of suffering. Some of his tools were deceptively simple. A device called the widow's caress was just a set of bound feathers dipped in acid, tickling until skin broke, laughter turning to howls, harmless until it wasn't. And then there were the suspended rooms, chains that dangled victims over shallow pits, their toes just brushing the floor, forced to balance endlessly or risk dislocating every joint. Some hung for days, moaning in rhythmic pain. Some sang to themselves. Others screamed until they tore their own vocal cords. But it wasn't just the devices. It was the duration, the relentlessness. Prusa's guards, more like cultists by now, operated in shifts. They rotated the victims, ensuring no one ever slept too long. No wound ever healed. No mind ever fully slipped, just teetered on the edge. This wasn't medieval punishment. It was a system of controlled psychological and physical erosion. And for the Count, it was art. He saw himself as a conductor, and the screams were his symphony. But outside the dungeon, something began to shift. A low-ranking guard went missing. Rumors began to leak. And far away, in a city untouched by the Count's gold or silence, a survivor was making her way back, barefoot, scarred, and ready to speak. Count Prusa didn't just revel in suffering. He studied it. Pain, to him, wasn't chaotic. It was measurable, observable, and, most disturbingly, perfectible. Among the most chilling of his preserved writings is a bound volume titled The Symphonics of Suffering. Not a grim diary, but a technical manual. In it, Prusa lays out his theories with cold, academic precision. He identifies pitch patterns of different types of agony, records how long it takes before a person's scream cracks, measures how pain matures over hours, days, even weeks. But his obsession ran deeper than sound. He believed that screaming was the soul's resistance, the final rebellion of spirit against bodily collapse. That in every shriek, there was truth. That by studying the voice in pain, he could learn what lay beneath humanity itself. To aid in this endeavor, Prusa studied with monks, torturers, surgeons, even singers. He obsessed over anatomy, particularly the throat and lungs. One recovered letter even details his request for a dissection of a soprano who died unexpectedly. Her larynx, he believed, could hold the secrets to higher pitch durability. Inside his dungeon, several rooms were engineered around acoustic experimentation. One, dubbed the crescendo chamber, was shaped like a teardrop, with a ceiling that funneled sound back toward the floor. Screams here didn't echo. They returned. Victims would cry out, only to hear their own voices crash back upon them seconds later, louder, warped, monstrous. But Prusa wasn't just collecting sound. He was feeding on it. Some theorize he suffered from a condition akin to misophonia in reverse, an arousal or euphoric response to certain frequencies of human suffering. One page from his notes reads, "When the fifth octave breaks, I feel it in my chest." The body reacts not in revulsion, but in communion. Their pain becomes my clarity. He hired musicians to transcribe the screams. Yes, sheet music of wails and moans. Notated, studied. In some twisted performances, he played them on organ or violin, claiming it was music pulled from the marrow. But the Count didn't stop at listening. He shaped screams. Some devices included vocal manipulation components, reeds, tubes, hollows. He'd force victims to scream through them, distorting their voices into warped, animalistic tones. This wasn't merely aesthetic. He wanted to break identity, to make victims unrecognizable even to themselves. He believed the mind would deteriorate faster if the person could not recognize their own voice. One invention, the echo hood, enclosed the victim's head in a cone-shaped helmet. Every sound they made was redirected instantly back into their ears at double volume. Prolonged exposure caused vomiting, seizures, and in rare cases, complete dissociative breakdown. Modern neuroscientists would later observe parallels to sensory overload experiments. Only Hruza's methods were far more extreme and intentionally irreversible. But the Count also saw patterns in the collapse. He documented that most people lose coherence after 72 hours of constant pain, that hallucinations begin after 40 hours of isolation. That complete surrender, when the screaming stops and the eyes glaze, is a transcendent moment. He called it the final harmony. In that stillness, there is no resistance. They become pure vibration, no longer body, no longer soul, just the scream. What drove him to this? Some claim madness. Others say it was belief, a dark theology he never fully revealed, except in fragments. That suffering purifies, that screams open doors, that in the sound of ultimate torment, one might hear something else. A force, a presence, not of this world. One final entry in his journal, scrawled in erratic hand, reads, "I heard her name in the screams today, the one who waits beyond the veil. She is coming through the throat." Whether metaphor or madness, no one could say. But his obsession deepened. He wasn't just a sadist. He was a seeker. And in the screams of his victims, he believed he'd found something sacred, something divine, or something damned. But far from the castle, a young woman wrapped in tattered cloth had crossed the mountains. She had no voice left to scream. But her story was about to break the silence. Long before noble courts heard a whisper, the fields already screamed. The peasants had known for years, though they couldn't prove it, though they dared not speak it aloud. The stories passed in hushed tones, over candlelight, under breath. Children were taught not bedtime rhymes, but warnings, songs meant to remind them. Don't go near the walls of stone, or you'll be meat, not skin and bone. The legends were old, older than the Count. But when he took over the land, they grew darker, sharper, closer to truth. Farmers began marking their doors with salt and ash. Milkmaids walked in groups. Shepherds tied bells to their sheep, not to warn off wolves, but to signal when someone vanished. Because people did vanish. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, but slowly, quietly, spread across years and regions. No mass grave was ever found. No public executions, only absence. And yet, the land around the castle remained untouched by rebellion. Why? Because fear is the greatest leash. The Count, as monstrous as he was, understood this perfectly. He fed it like livestock. He cultivated mystery. He encouraged the folklore. Let the peasants believe there were ghosts, witches, even demons in the woods, anything but him. And the peasants, in their desperation, crafted rituals to keep the darkness at bay. They began placing stones in a circle at their doors, burning lavender and garlic, not for scent, but to choke the ears of the screamers. Some buried iron nails under their beds. Others painted sigils they didn't understand on their children's foreheads. But the most chilling tradition was called the Listen. Once a month, on the night of no moon, villagers would walk barefoot into the hills and lie on the earth, face down, hands spread, and listen. They said, if the wind was still and the world silent, you could hear the dungeon breathe, a faint hum deep underground. Not mechanical, not natural, a pulse. And if you heard a voice, a whisper, a sob, a moan, you had to get up immediately and return home. Because to linger was to invite it in. One girl did not return from the Listen. When her parents found her days later, she was alive, barely, covered in dirt, eyes rolled back, whispering a single word over and over, harmony, harmony, harmony. She never recovered. Local priests tried to exorcise what they thought was demonic possession. But one went mad during the ritual, tearing out his tongue. Another hung himself the next morning, leaving behind only a note. The scream is a door. Even so, the peasants endured. What else could they do? There was no army to call, no law that would touch nobility. To survive, they did what peasants always did. They suffered in silence. They buried their dead quickly. They wept behind locked doors. And they prayed to be invisible. But not all remained passive. A widow named Eliska began keeping records. Quietly, brave beyond reason, she collected names of the missing, dates, locations. She taught children to remember songs of warning, not joy. She urged neighbors to share what they knew, to prepare, if not to fight, at least to witness. Her notes, later found hidden in a well, form the only surviving grassroots record of the dungeon's impact on the region. One passage reads, "We do not live in this village. We survive under it. The ground beneath us is no longer earth. It is mouth, and it feeds on us one by one." Still, Count Hruzza continued unhindered. Until one winter night, during a blizzard that turned roads to rivers of ice, a young woman staggered into the town square. Barefoot, bloodied, shivering, she collapsed in front of the chapel. In her hand, a rusted shackle, still bearing a sliver of her own skin. She had escaped. The villagers carried her inside, wrapped her in blankets, fed her what little they had. She could not speak. Her vocal cords were torn beyond use. But she could write, and what she wrote would finally force the outside world to listen. The girl's name was Annetta. She was 19, or had been, before the dungeon. Her story, scrawled in shaking lines across torn parchment, was almost too horrific to believe. Not just because of the details, but because of the pattern it revealed, one that exposed a rot far deeper than any single man's cruelty. Annetta had been taken during one of Count Hruzza's lavish banquets. Every season, the Count hosted nobles from distant courts, Hungarian magnates, Austrian diplomats, even a few Prussian lords. These events were famed for their excess: roasted swans, fountains of wine, massed performances. Music played through the night, echoing down stone halls as noble guests danced under candlelit chandeliers. But beneath the floorboards, people screamed. Annetta wasn't a servant. She wasn't even scheduled to be near the castle. She was chosen randomly, plucked from a village 40 miles away. One of a group of 5 undesirables arrested on false charges by the Count's guards and transported in a sealed cart under cover of snow. She wrote that her arrival at the castle was like being swallowed by a god. Her chains were removed, her clothes stripped. She and the others were scrubbed clean, not in care, but preparation. Then separated. And so began the nightmare. Each night above them, the nobles drank, laughed, and toasted their host's impeccable taste. Below, in the choir hall, Annetta and the others were introduced to the devices. One by one, she described the whispers, the way the guards treated her not as a human, but a note in a melody. How they referred to victims as low pitch, good sustain, or fragile larynx. She was told she had a silver scream. Her torment was timed, orchestrated, coinciding with crescendos in the banquet halls. When noble guests clinked glasses at midnight, the guards tightened her restraints. When music reached its peak, so did the pain. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a performance. Every noble feast came paired with a live score of suffering beneath the floor. Count Hruzza himself would descend between courses, nodding to guards, adjusting settings, scribbling in his notebook. He wore gloves of deep red leather and carried a cane tipped with a phonograph needle. To listen more precisely, she wrote. Annetta believed the banquets were not just indulgence, they were complicity. That the guests knew. That the nobles, while perhaps unaware of the full scale, understood something terrible was happening and accepted it. Or worse, enjoyed the ambience it provided. Some of them even requested specific notes during dessert. The Count called this entire experience the duet, the harmony between pleasure and pain, joy and horror, above and below. Annetta endured weeks. She learned to breathe through pain, to scream less, to rob them of satisfaction. This made things worse. They moved her to the mirror box, then to the breath harp. They forced sound from her like blood from a wound. But she never forgot. She remembered names, faces, routines, and she learned, slowly, how the place moved, how certain guards were drunk by morning, how some locks were older than others. One night, during a rare lapse in the guard rotation, caused, she believed, by a noble guest requesting an extended session, Annetta used a loosened shackle to pry a hinge, crawled through a drain tunnel filled with filth and rats, escaped into the snow. She walked for 2 days, half naked, half mad. When she arrived in the village square, she collapsed. But she had made it. The priests read her testimony. The villagers confirmed details only a victim could know. And when they compared her timeline to local records of when feasts had been held at the castle, it matched. Every time the Count threw a celebration, someone had disappeared. Annetta's word spread, smuggled on scraps of parchment by monks, carried by merchants, whispered in taverns. Her voice, though broken, grew louder than any scream she'd ever given. Finally, someone listened. A royal investigator was dispatched from Vienna, a man with a reputation for discretion and ruthlessness. His name, Gregor Merrick. He arrived not with guards, but with scribes. He wasn't there to arrest the count. He was there to document the truth. What he found would nearly drive him mad. When royal investigator Gregor Merrick arrived at Hruza Castle, he was unimpressed by its grandeur. He was a man of iron resolve, dispatched not to protect the crown, but to protect its reputation. And yet, even he was unprepared for what lay beneath those opulent walls. The count welcomed him personally, smiling, gracious, unbothered. He offered wine, made jokes, promised transparency. "I have nothing to hide," he said. "Let my halls speak for themselves." They would. For the first day, Merrick was led only through the visible parts of the estate: ballrooms, parlors, libraries. He noted the faint hum underfoot, but his hosts dismissed it as pipes. On the second day, Merrick demanded access to the lower levels. The count complied, partially. He showed him the wine cellars, the food storage, and a room filled with dusty barrels labeled for royal reserve. But there was one door that remained locked. It was steel, not wood, reinforced, with no handle on the outside. When Merrick asked, the count replied, "Oh, that? An old cold room. Not in use anymore." His tone was too casual, too prepared. So Merrick returned that night, alone. He bribed a kitchen boy to distract the guard, slipped down into the cellar, and broke the lock. What he found wasn't just a chamber. It was a labyrinth of engineered evil. The dungeon was vast, coiling through bedrock in a sprawl of rooms, corridors, and passages that had never been recorded on any blueprint submitted to the crown. He found blood, bones, restraints, scraps of fabric, symbols etched into stone, mirrors cracked and stained with what he hoped was rust. And everywhere, the smell, acrid, foul, like iron and rot and sorrow soaked into the walls. Merrick didn't scream. He took notes, and he brought them back to court. What followed was a confession trial unlike any in European memory. Hruza was arrested, yes, but not paraded in chains. Instead, he was summoned under royal inquiry, a courtesy afforded to nobles. It was only during the questioning, when Merrick presented a list of 127 names, compiled from peasant reports, missing person notices, and survivor testimony, that Hruza's mask began to slip. At first, the count denied everything. Then, slowly, he admitted too much. He claimed the dungeon had been constructed as an experiment in moral thresholds, that his guests knew only as much as they could handle, that he was building something eternal. When asked why he had recorded so many screams, he simply replied, "Because voices fade, but music lives forever." And then came the final blow. One of the scribes, poring over the journals found in the castle, discovered an entry labeled "Harmony" through patrons. It listed dates, names, donations, dozens of noble families, all with entries beside them like, "Enjoyed the echo room," "Requested soprano next time," "Contributed 2 performers," "Suggested iron reeds for better pitch," "Approved expansion of mirror box," "Promised silence if kept private." The court went into uproar. What was supposed to be the condemnation of a single madman began to look like the unveiling of a secret society. Whispers filled the corridors of Vienna. How many nobles had known? How many had heard the screams and clinked their glasses anyway? A survivor, Annetta, was brought in to testify. Her voice broken, she whispered one sentence that would echo in royal chambers for years: "When nobles feast, peasants vanish." The court fell silent. But then, silence turned to strategy. The monarchy feared what a public trial would unleash. Noble houses demanded discretion. Merrick was quietly dismissed, paid handsomely to forget. Hruza? He was sentenced, not to execution, but to seclusion. Locked in a monastery, deep in the Alps. A mercy few believed he deserved. His dungeon was sealed. The estate confiscated. Records burned. Survivors silenced. But some, like Merrick, made copies. And one day, those documents would resurface. Because secrets rot in darkness. And screams, no matter how deep, eventually rise. Count Matej Hruza's trial was, by every visible measure, a scandalous but brief affair. The headlines read like closure: Mad Count confesses to atrocities, sentenced to lifelong confinement. Pamphlets in Vienna hailed it as a victory of law over madness. Justice had been served, they said. But behind the scenes, the truth was suffocating under velvet gloves. The trial was held in a closed court. Only 3 surviving victims were permitted to testify. Only 6 of Hruzā's guards were ever questioned. None were punished. The nobles whose names appeared in the Harmony through Patron's ledger vanished from the discussion entirely. Their influence ran too deep, bankrolling art, politics, even the very judges presiding over the case. Royal investigator Gregor Merrick was instructed to redact his findings. He refused, and within a month, he vanished. His belongings burned in a freak fire. His name erased from the investigation logs. But not before he had copied his notes. Dozens of sealed envelopes, handwritten testimonies, sketches of devices, architectural drawings of the dungeon, a complete record of the horror. He distributed them to monks, scholars, and sympathetic nobility across Europe. Some survived. Most didn't. It was a quiet war. A war against memory. The monarchy needed to maintain the illusion that Hruzā was an isolated sadist, a deranged anomaly, not a symptom of something larger. Because if people believed he acted alone, the world could move on. But if they learned that nobility fed on screams, that some of Europe's most respected families had died to the rhythm of torture, the empire would collapse under its own hypocrisy. So they buried it. Literally. The dungeon beneath Hruzā Castle was bricked up. Every corridor sealed with stone and lead. The land deed was erased. Maps were altered. The surrounding village, already dying from fear and famine, was quietly relocated. Its name scrubbed from records. Its soil declared unfit for agriculture and abandoned. But horror, like rot, seeps through cracks. Over the next decades, children in neighboring towns began singing twisted nursery rhymes. Verses that didn't make sense. Verses that mentioned the breath harp, the mirror box, and the scream that eats you from inside. Old men would whisper of nights when they heard weeping beneath the earth. Priests refused to sleep in churches built too close to the hill where Hruzā's castle once stood. And in 1893, a group of German explorers, amateur historians, stumbled upon a collapsed passage in the forest. Behind it, they found steps, descending into stone. They never returned. One journal was recovered from the site. Its final entry reads, "We heard music, but there are no instruments. No wind. Just breathing stone." The monarchy again denied everything. By the turn of the century, Count Hruzā's story had become folklore. A boogeyman tale told to frighten children. But the documents Gregor Merrick scattered? Some survived. Hidden in monasteries, locked in private collections, whispered among occult historians. In 1931, one such document resurfaced in Prague. A partial blueprint of the choir hall, annotated with strange markings, musical notations overlaying human anatomy. It was acquired by Nazi researchers and disappeared again. Later, the Soviets were rumored to have found Hruzā's journals in a buried crate near Brno during a dig for wartime tunnels. No official record exists. Yet in every century since Hruzā's fall, whispers return. The trial was meant to end him, but instead it immortalized him, not as a man, but as a myth that refuses to die. Because once you build a place meant to capture screams forever, they never stop echoing. Today, there is no castle, no official record of Count Matej Hruzā's estate. The land it stood on is now a stretch of overgrown forest, thick with ivy and unease. Birds do not nest there. Hunters avoid it. GPS maps list it only as undeveloped terrain. But locals still whisper the name. Hruzā Hill. Even now, centuries later, strange occurrences persist. Hikers speak of unnatural stillness, no wind, no sound, as if the forest holds its breath. Campers report distant cries at night. Not animals, not human either. Some say you can feel a vibration beneath your feet, like the heartbeat of something buried. And then, there's the church nearby, abandoned long ago. The altar is split down the middle. The bell is gone. But scratched into the stone pews, dozens of times over, in different hands and languages, is one word: harmony. It's as if the Count's twisted theology never truly left. As if, through the centuries, others have found something in those ruins. Something that still speaks. Or sings. The dungeon itself has never been rediscovered. Not fully. Those who try don't try twice. In 2008, an independent film crew set out to document the legend of the Screaming Castle. They vanished. Their equipment was later found in a shallow ditch, burned, but intact. The final tape contained 37 minutes of static, and then a single sound. Not a scream, not a voice, but a note, sustained, echoing, vibrating through metal and bone. Acoustic engineers tried to analyze the frequency. Their conclusion? It isn't possible. It's not one sound. It's layers, hundreds of them, like screams folded into one. Then the tape went missing. But the stories continue. Passed in dark corners of the internet. Investigated by underground historians, paranormal researchers, and those obsessed with forbidden architecture. The dungeon has become legend, but a legend rooted in fact. A horror buried in bureaucracy and blood. And though Count Hruzza is long dead, his creation, his symphony of suffering, may still be alive. There are rumors of new disciples. People seeking the chamber, hoping to hear the final harmony, believing, like Hruzza did, that in the perfect scream lies a doorway to something beyond flesh, beyond sound, beyond human. Some say the echoes remain because the victims were never laid to rest. Others say the dungeon itself became sentient, alive through suffering, feeding on memory. But one thing is certain, pain doesn't vanish. It roots, it waits, and sometimes it sings back. The story of Count Hruzza is more than a disturbing footnote in history. It is a mirror, reflecting what power does when unchecked, what silence enables, and how suffering, when hidden beneath layers of luxury and denial, never truly disappears. It echoes, through time, through myth, through us. What began as whispers under stone became a chorus of pain that outlived empires. And perhaps, somewhere beneath our feet, it's still playing. If this story left you chilled, haunted, or stunned, consider subscribing. There are more tales buried in forgotten pages and sealed archives. More horrors the world tried to erase. And we will uncover them. Leave a comment. What do you believe happened to the dungeon? Was it destroyed, or does it still exist, waiting for someone to listen? Watch our next episode. The cannibal aristocrat who served his enemies at his own funeral. Until then, remember, not all screams fade. Some are built to last.